It's finally here. The F-4J has been added to the American tech tree in War Thunder, giving pilots access to pulse Doppler radar and a new missile. Let's check it out. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II began life as a project in 1953 to update and replace the F-3H Demon, but the design was originally not accepted for production. They went back to the drawing board and used their existing work as the basis for a new two-seat all-weather fleet defense fighter that was requested by the U.S. Navy. The thinking of the time was that air-to-air missiles were going to be the only weapon used in future air battles, and the aircraft was designed around that paradigm and intended to be a so-called missile truck, which would take position, fire off a salvo of long-range missiles operated by the second crew member, and then go home without the need for any close-in dogfighting with guns. In hindsight, that seems a bit optimistic and naive, but it represented the best thinking of its day. To this end, initial Navy versions of the F-4 Phantom were put into service without an internal cannon, armed only with early versions of the AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. Early combat experience in the Vietnam War showed that doctrine to be fundamentally flawed, and external gun pods were rushed into service for most versions of the F-4. The F-4J was the first major upgrade for the U.S. Navy, and represented a major production run for the plane, with over 500 being built. The J model had upgraded engines, an advanced pulse Doppler radar system, reinforced landing gear, an upgraded ejection seat, and a few aerodynamic refinements. An important note, leading-edge wing slats were not introduced to U.S. Navy Phantoms until the F-4S version in 1977. And the moving sections on the front of the F-4J's wing is actually a component of the plane's flap system. The primary user of the F-4J was the U.S. Navy, though the plane was also used as the basis for Phantoms delivered to the United Kingdom. The U.S. Navy retired the last of its F-4s in the 1990s. In War Thunder, the F-4J currently sits at the end of the American Air Tree's Naval Fighter Column. Its weapon system is based around the AN/APG-59 radar set, which includes a pulse Doppler radar mode, ACM boresight mode, and a variety of range and angle presets. As of making this review, this is the most capable radar set currently fitted to an American aircraft in the game, and the plane also includes a full ballistics computer for all of its weapons. The weapon loadouts of this plane include a huge selection of missiles, gun pods, bombs, and unguided rockets in different combinations. Keep in mind that the plane has no internal cannon, so if you want any gun at all, you need to take the centerline gun pod with your loadout. Your entry-level air-to-air missile is the AIM-9D, which is a pretty decent starting weapon, and much better than the AIM-9Bs and R3S that some of the other top-end planes get stuck with. You graduate to the AIM-9G, which is a very capable heat seeker with strong off-bore sight performance. For semi-active radar missiles, you start with the AIM-7E2, which is a far more capable missile than earlier versions of the Sparrow, and even though it's classified as a dogfight missile, it's most effective at medium ranges. The real star of the show, though, is the new AIM-7F. The F model of the Sparrow is heavier, carries a new two-stage rocket motor, has a larger warhead, and has better range and improved tracking from its predecessors. An important detail to keep in mind, the 7F is a slower missile than you might expect, and only flies at Mach 3. Combined with its superior lock-on range, this means that it can seem to take quite a while for the 7F to reach its targets if you yeet this thing off at maximum range. I'm including footage in this review of a couple of long-range hits just to kind of illustrate this point, and I want to point out that when you see me launch two of these things at long range, I'm doing it for redundancy in case one of them fails, not because I was impatient. With the addition of the F-4J's advanced pulse Doppler radar and the AIM-7F, The US Air Tree finally has a highly competitive beyond visual range all-altitude combat capability. About time. The flight performance of the F-4J is going to both impress you and possibly let you down. As with all Phantoms, its engine power is quite good, with strong acceleration, rate of climb, and maximum speed. However, the F-4J doesn't include the leading-edge slats of the Air Force's F-4E, and its sustained turn rate isn't quite as good as lighter dogfighters. While testing this plane out, I didn't have any issues with wing ripping, but I did rip my combat flaps a couple of times by accident. You can deploy them up to at around 750 kilometers an hour, which isn't slow, but this plane is quite zippy, and it's easy to think you're going slower than you are when you cut into a turn after a merge. That said, the F-4J is still a heavy plane, and it's most comfortable at medium to high speeds. Its strong engine power gives it enough thrust to maintain a constant speed in between about 480 and 550 kilometers an hour in sustained turns, but just be aware that the actual turn rate isn't amazing, even if it can be sustained until you run out of fuel. You can run some other planes out of energy in these sustained turns, but you usually won't be able to outrate them, so play to your strengths. Another thing to watch is your fuel consumption. With the introduction of the new large battlefield maps in RB carried over from simulator battles, fuel management is something you have to pay attention to now, and I'm going to start mentioning it more when I do these reviews. With the F-4J, I had enough fuel to run longer range sorties on the large maps, but I had to moderate my speeds and use my afterburners a little bit more sparingly. On smaller maps, you won't have any issues and you can just brute force through most of your flight. Flying the F-4J out in missions basically comes down to a question of which air-to-air missiles you have unlocked. Now, the plane does have a fair amount of air-to-ground weapons and gets a full ballistics computer, so you can take this out as a ground pounder. But once you have good missiles unlocked, why would you want to? Flying out with an air-to-ground loadout can be useful for grinding upgrades, but once you have the plane's missiles unlocked, you can leave the bombs back in the maintenance hangar. There are dedicated ground attack planes much more suitable than this is. The combination of an advanced radar set, off-boresight infrared missiles, and long-range, high-energy semi-active radar missiles makes this a natural fighter interceptor. Out at missions, I was sometimes able to get a radar lock on enemy strikers surprisingly early into a sortie, and I honestly felt kinda guilty about some of the BVR yeet shots I was able to connect. Now, my personal preference when making a BVR missile shot is usually to fire 2 missiles about 4 to 5 seconds apart, but most players will probably prefer to conserve ammo. That's totally all good. Managing your actively selected weapon will be important, and finally having access to a pulse Doppler radar set with good long-range missiles gives American pilots mission options that they haven't really had in War Thunder before. Low-level head-on engagements will be easier, high-level long-range engagements will be easier, and attacking low-flying targets after an initial climb-out will be easier. The usual F4 mission profiles still work fine. The side climb to space and clean up the leftovers thing still works great. Flying the tip of the spear, first in to the fight, still works great. All of it. Overall, the F-4J doesn't redefine the role of the F-4, it's just better at those roles than all the other F-4 versions. A final thought about grinding upgrades on this plane. As with the other models of F-4 in the game, I suspect it's going to be a popular thing to do to use ground pounding to help unlock the upgrades and, get the air-to-air missiles all set before you transition to focus on air combat. That's a completely legitimate method to grind upgrades on jets like this. And with the full ballistics computer, the F-4J certainly lends itself well to being a supersonic bomb truck. But my advice is that once you do transition purely to air-to-air combat, stick with air combat. Loading up on bombs cripples a plane like this in a dogfight, and dumping them early is just wasted potential. If you're not going to bomb anything, just don't take the bombs. Visually, well, it's a Phantom. The F4 is generally an okay-looking plane, and the F-4J gets a set of really nice-looking choices for a paint job. I like all of them. But it's required by law where I live to use the Blue Angels paint job whenever possible, so that was my choice for this plane. Landing the F-4J is, again, pretty typical for an F-4 Phantom. You have an arrestor hook that you'll never get to use, and a drag chute, and very sturdy landing gear. You can safely drop flaps and gear a bit over 400 kilometers an hour, so hot landings aren't any problem for the F-4J. Remember, this thing was built to land on aircraft carriers. The cockpit is okay, but still only has a gun sight instead of a full heads-up display. The radar scope is mounted top center, which is a good position for it, but the lack of an easily visible radar warning receiver is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Overall, the F-4J has a good cockpit with solid visibility, but it's just not what I look for myself. To close out on the F-4J, this plane finally has an advanced pulse Doppler radar system, with very capable long-range missiles. It's fast, has an adequate supply of countermeasures, and has multi-role mission loadouts if that's your thing. However, you can still be outturned by lighter dogfighters, and taking the external gun pod, which is almost a necessity, does impact your overall flight performance. The final verdict on the F-4J is that American pilots in War Thunder have been waiting a long time for this one. It's here, and it lives up to expectations. While not a super maneuverable dogfighter, the weapon system is outstanding, and I suspect that this will become the go-to fighter for a lot of players once they unlock it. As always, thanks for watching.